Hello, everyone. This is Professor Hasselman, and today we're going to be talking about, and this is History 107, and today we're going to be talking about the rise of Russia. Now, Russia poses a bit of a problem for world historians. Is it a civilization all its own, or part of a slightly larger East European civilization? Should it be handled, as is commonly the case in European history, texts as part of Europe, though not a leading part? And how important is Russia? Now, developments in the early modern period, crucial in Russian history per se, suggest the need to treat Russia separately, but with a clear asterisk. They also suggest the importance of Russian expansion on the world history stage. Early modern Russia warrants attention as an unusually durable example of the phenomenon of gunpowder empires, as a society increasingly influential in Middle Eastern and Asian, as well as European history, and as a first instance of selective westernization, an example of a pattern that will resound more widely in world history later on, providing, among other things, a comparative benchmark. Now, the early modern centuries saw a significant rise of Russia in world affairs, along with important changes in Russian political and cultural patterns. Categorizing Russia is a bit of a problem for world historians. In these lectures, we've defined Russia and possibly a larger Eastern European zone as a distinct civilization, although new relationships Russia developed with the West in the early modern period blur this distinction somewhat. An East European zone existed beyond Russia's borders, sharing with Russia, in some cases, commitment to Orthodox Christianity and to some common agricultural systems. Now, the primary Russian theme in this period was territorial expansion. Between 1450 and 1750, Russian territory expanded steadily in several directions, not yet reaching its current dimension, but, without question, creating a substantial gunpowder empire. One factor that pushed Russia to expand was the desire to drive the Mongols further away. Russia was also driven by the idea of itself as the heir to the Byzantine Empire. Along with this notion was some sense of a religious mission. Russia frequently insisted that it had a role to play in Middle East in defense of Christianity, especially Orthodox Christianity. And as the early modern period progressed, the Russian state and individual groups such as the Cossacks also developed a direct state in expansion. Expansion was one of the ways in which the Tsars could justify their rule, and other groups sought new opportunities to obtain land. Expansion took several directions. The most important expansion was southward into Central Asia and to the borders of the Ottoman Empire. Here, Russia began to influence world affairs in fundamental ways. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Russian-Ottoman conflict increasingly moved to the advantage of the Russians. Russia was involved in pushing the Ottoman Empire back, gaining new territories to the south and the southeast in the process. Russian expansion also eliminated Central Asia and its nomadic groups as an independent factor in Eurasian affairs. Russian expansion, along with Chinese and Ottoman expansion, increasingly placed most of Central Asia under the control of an organized state. Russian expansion began to produce a Muslim minority in Russia. Although Russia cast itself as a European state, the Tsar presented himself as a ruler who operated in a Muslim tradition. The second direction of Russian expansion was westward, when Russia began to move into Ukraine and other territories that brought it directly into East Central European affairs. By the end of the 17th century, Russia played a role in military and diplomatic interactions with such countries as Sweden, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary. After about 1750, Russia would assume a more general role in Eastern diplomacy. This push westward brought new minorities into Russian rule, including Jews and German ethnic minorities. The third direction of Russian expansion was eastward, across the Ural Mountains into Siberia and ultimately even beyond. By the 18th century, this move brought Russia into direct contact with China. The mid-18th century Amur River Treaty established a border between China and Russia that indicated the extent to which Russia was now a minor player in East Asian affairs. During the 18th century, Russia pressed beyond East Asia into Alaska, and Russian explorers moved south from Alaska into present-day Northern California. Russian trading expeditions even reached the northernmost islands of Hawaii. Now, by 1750, Russia had one of the largest land masses under single rule that had ever existed. The expansion established Russia as a multinational society at the same time that Western Europe was emphasizing the nation-state. The multinational quality would be both a strength of and a challenge to Russia from this point onward. And this expansion also established Russia as a frontier society, particularly in the east, but also in parts of Central Asia. Now, two devices were used in the early modern period to hold the Russian territory together. The first device was the strong assertion of the power of the central state and its ruler, the Tsar, but state authority was often hollow. The second device was essentially an agreement between the state and the landlord class. Both big landlords and gentry-level landlords were given increasing political and economic powers to run local courts, administer justice, punish criminals, levy taxes, and require labor service from serfs. This decentralization into a state-based management gave Russia the opportunity to establish at least some political stability even in its huge new territories. Now, once in a while, this agreement between the Tsar and his nobles broke down and trouble ensued. For the most part, however, the agreement held steady because both parties had a stake in preserving the system. In the latter 17th century, Russia embarked on another important pattern of change: Westernization. Peter the Great decided that to maintain Russia's military mission and to further Russia's goals of becoming a European power, significant changes had to occur involving Russia's imitation of patterns then visible in the West. Westernization reforms under Peter took several directions. One set of changes was what we might call cosmetic. Peter insisted that his nobles trim off their Mongol-like beards and adopt Western dress rather than Asian. Western cultural institutions were imported into Russia, notably the ballet. These various changes added up to a major effort to alter Russia's cultural orientation in significant directions. The second set of changes involved efforts to improve Russian education, particularly for the upper classes and scientific work. Under Peter, new scientific academies and universities were established, including the State University of St. Petersburg. All nobles were to receive training in mathematics, and they would not be allowed to marry if they did not obtain an educational certificate. The third set of changes was political and fairly straightforward. Peter developed somewhat more specialized bureaucratic services and created a state council to oversee bureaucratic activities. Peter instituted significant, though not uniform, military and economic changes. He established a Russian navy, importing Western artisans and advisors to do so. He tried to improve the armament of the Russian army and reorganized the army into somewhat clearer categories of command along partially Western lines. He also organized the Russian metallurgical industry, taking advantage of Russia's holdings in iron ore to build an economic basis for independent weapons production and to equip Russia's armies without having to rely on Western imports. Now, what were the goals of Peter's program of Westernization? The first goal was to enhance the power of the Tsar and the state in what was still a fairly ineffective state apparatus. The second goal was to enhance the power of the Russian military so that it could play a role in European affairs and would have an edge in its military conflicts elsewhere, especially with the Ottoman Empire. The third goal was to address what one might call an embarrassment factor with Russia vis-a-vis the West. Peter assumed that interchange between Russia and the West would become more frequent, and that without some changes, Russia would be viewed by Westerners as barbaric and backwards. One way to deal with this problem was to make at least upper-class Russia look increasingly Western. Equally important, however, was what Peter the Great did not Westernize. He did not import Western ideas about constitutional monarchy, the parliamentary tradition, or the division of powers. Peter was interested in any significant reform, or was not interested, in any significant reforms that affected ordinary Russians. He did not ameliorate the conditions of the serfs, nor did he institute a wage labor economy in Russia. He did not try to bring cultural or educational change to ordinary Russians either. Perhaps most revealing of all, Peter clearly did not want to make Russia a commercial economy in the Western model. Now, if we go back to the terms of the world economy, Peter's goal was to maintain Russia as an external economy, capable of producing what it needed for its own economic operation and for its expanding military activity, for not seeking commercial dominance over areas outside of Russia. Now, the Westernization program was quite real, but ironically enhanced some of Russia's differences with the West. Russia joined Western cultural life, and Peter the Great was obviously eager to further Russia's role as a European diplomatic and military player. But he was not interested in creating a Western society. In confirming or widening the gap between ordinary Russians and the upper classes, Peter created circumstances that were quite different from those of the West, and would have different outcomes later. Peter's changes had at least two unintended consequences that, from this point onward, would inform Russian affairs and continue to differentiate Russia from the West while also connecting it to the West, without any question. After Peter's death, Orthodox clergy and some landlords voiced concerns about the implications of Westernization. The result was an ongoing ambivalence about what Russia's relationship with the West would be. Although Peter intended for Russia to remain an external economy, his actions encouraged involvement in the European-dominated economy on terms that were not favorable to Russia. The desire for Western goods pushed Russia into the position of a peripheral economy, emphasizing timber, minerals, and grains in its exports and depending on serf labor. Now, Westernization probably did help maintain the military strength of the Russian imperial experiment, but it also set in motion other currents that would have further effects on Russia's relationship with the wider world, sometimes fostering new links, particularly with the West, but sometimes creating new tensions as well.